I stood frozen at my parents' 50th wedding anniversary party as my cousin Amanda stormed toward me, fury blazing in her eyes. The entire family had just heard my spontaneous speech, revealing decades of hidden abuse and manipulation. Crystal glasses shattered on the marble floor as relatives gasped and whispered. My mother clutched her pearl's face, drained of color, while my father's jaw tightened with barely contained rage. The elegant ballroom fell silent except for Amanda's heels clicking closer. Everything I worked years to bury had exploded into the open, and there was no going back now. 3 months before that disastrous evening, I was sitting in my Denver apartment staring at an ornate invitation that had arrived in my mailbox. The gold-embossed lettering announced my parents' milestone celebration with all the pomp and circumstance you'd expect from Dr. Harold Mitchell and his wife Eleanor. My name is Rodney Mitchell, and at 32, I'd spent the last decade building a life as a software engineer, carefully maintaining exactly 1,200 miles between myself and my childhood home in suburban Philadelphia. The invitation felt heavy in my hands, not just from the expensive cardstock, but from the weight of expectations it carried. My parents had always been masters of presentation. Dad was a respected cardiologist at Philadelphia General Hospital, the kind of doctor who still made house calls for his wealthiest patients. Mom served on the boards of 3 different charities and had turned their 6-bedroom colonial mansion into a showcase for endless fundraisers and community events. From the outside, we were the picture-perfect American family. Holiday cards featured us in matching sweaters smiling broadly in front of our perfectly decorated Christmas tree. Local newspapers occasionally featured articles about Dad's medical achievements or Mom's charitable work, always mentioning their wonderful children and strong family values. I had grown up watching neighbors point us out as examples of what a successful family should look like. But as I held that invitation, my hands began to tremble slightly. The formal language and elegant design couldn't hide what this really was: a command performance. My parents expected their 3 children to return home, put on our best clothes, and help them celebrate 50 years of what everyone believed was marital bliss and exemplary parenting. I was still debating whether to attend when my phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I felt that familiar mix of protective love and deep concern that always accompanied calls from my younger sister. At 29, Sarah had always been the most sensitive of us 3 kids, and the past few years had been particularly difficult for her. Rodney. Her voice sounded fragile, like she was fighting back tears. Did you get their invitation? Just looking at it now, I replied, settling back into my leather couch. Are you planning to go? The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I can't pretend anymore, Rodney. I've been seeing a therapist for 6 months now, and she says I have severe anxiety and depression stemming from childhood trauma. I wake up in cold sweats, having nightmares about being locked in that hall closet for hours because I accidentally spilled juice on Mom's white carpet. My mouth went dry. Sarah was talking about memories I thought only I carried. The hall closet punishment was something our parents used frequently, claiming it taught us consequences for carelessness. They'd lock us in that dark, cramped space that smelled like mothballs and cleaning supplies sometimes for entire afternoons while they went about their daily routines downstairs. Sarah, I whispered, you remember that too. I remember all of it, Rodney. The closets, the way they'd take away our belongings for weeks at a time as lessons in detachment. How they convinced us that everything bad that happened was our fault for not being good enough children. My therapist calls it systematic psychological abuse. The words hung in the air between us. Neither of us had ever used that term before, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a key turning in a lock I'd kept sealed for years. They made us believe we were lucky to have such dedicated parents. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. Remember how they'd tell their friends about the sacrifices they made for us, how much time and money they invested in making us proper human beings. They turned parenting into a performance art, and we were just props in their show. I found myself nodding, even though she couldn't see me. I remembered countless dinner parties where our parents would parade us out to greet guests, showing off our good manners and accomplishments before sending us back to our rooms. We were evidence of their superior parenting skills, not actual children with thoughts and feelings of our own. "I can't go to that anniversary party," Sarah said firmly. "I can't stand there and watch everyone celebrate them while knowing what they really did to us. I can't smile and play along with the charade anymore." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, staring at the city lights twinkling below. Sarah's revelation had cracked something open inside me, releasing a flood of memories I'd worked so hard to suppress. The twisted thing was that our parents' public image wasn't entirely fabricated. They had provided for us, materially ensured we received excellent educations, and maintained a household that looked perfect from the outside. But behind closed doors, they'd systematically dismantled our sense of self-worth, convincing us that love was conditional on perfect behavior and absolute obedience. They'd isolated us from potential allies by carefully controlling our relationships with extended family members and discouraging friendships they deemed unsuitable. Most insidiously, they'd trained us to believe that questioning their methods meant we were ungrateful, disrespectful children who didn't deserve the privileges they provided. The next morning, I called our older brother Marcus in California. If anyone would understand, it would be him. He'd escaped first, moving to Los Angeles right after college, and building a successful career in entertainment law. Surely he'd noticed the same patterns, experienced the same manipulations. But Marcus's reaction shocked me to my core. The moment I mentioned Sarah's therapy revelations, his voice turned cold and defensive. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Rodney?" Suddy. "Our parents dedicated their lives to raising us properly, and now you want to drag them through the mud based on some therapist's wild theories." Sarah's always been dramatic and oversensitive. "Maybe instead of encouraging her to blame our parents for every problem in her life, you should suggest she take some personal responsibility." The phone felt like ice against my ear. Marcus wasn't just dismissing our concerns. He was actively defending the very behaviors that had damaged us. Either he'd completely blocked out those memories, or he'd chosen to reframe them as normal parenting. The brother I'd hoped would validate our experiences had become another wall of denial. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out a legal pad and began writing down every specific incident I could remember, dating them as precisely as possible. If I was going to confront this family mythology, I needed to be armed with facts, not just feelings. What I discovered as I filled page after page was a pattern of behavior so consistent and calculated that it couldn't possibly have been accidental. The invitation still sat on my coffee table, gleaming with its promise of celebration and joy. But now it looked different to me, like a trap disguised as a party. My parents were expecting their 3 successful children to return home and participate in the grand finale of their parenting performance. They had no idea that 2 of their productions were finally ready to break character. The weeks following that phone call with Sarah became a psychological excavation project I never intended to begin. Once I started remembering specific incidents from our childhood, the floodgates opened completely. Memories I'd buried under years of career focus and geographical distance came rushing back with startling clarity, each one fitting perfectly into a pattern I could no longer ignore. I found myself waking up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding from dreams about standing in corners for hours while my parents entertained guests in the next room. This was another favorite punishment technique of theirs, something they called reflection time. We'd be positioned facing a wall in the formal dining room, forbidden to move or speak, while they hosted their dinner parties mere feet away. The humiliation was exquisite and intentional, turning family gatherings into public exhibitions of their parental authority. My girlfriend Emma noticed the changes in my behavior immediately. We'd been dating for 8 months, and she'd grown accustomed to my usual calm, controlled demeanor. But suddenly I was jumpier, more withdrawn, spending hours staring out windows without speaking. Emma worked as a third-grade teacher and had developed a keen sense for recognizing trauma responses in both children and adults. One evening, she found me sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by handwritten pages, reliving and documenting incident after incident. I'd written about the time Dad confiscated my birthday presents because I'd argued with Sarah about whose turn it was to take out the trash. Those gifts disappeared forever, and when relatives asked about them later, my parents explained that I'd decided to donate them to less fortunate children as a gesture of maturity and generosity. "Rodney, you've been writing for 3 hours straight," Emma said gently, settling into the chair beside me. "What's all this?" I looked up at her concerned brown eyes and felt something crack open in my chest. Emma represented everything my parents would have disapproved of in a romantic partner. She was warm where they valued cool sophistication, spontaneous where they demanded careful planning, and genuinely caring where they performed calculated charm. She loved me for exactly who I was, not for who I might become with sufficient molding and correction. "My sister Sarah has been going to therapy." I began, then found myself telling her everything. About the closet punishments, the systematic removal of personal belongings, the way our parents would promise special outings or treats only to revoke them at the last minute for microscopic infractions. I told her about holidays ruined by impossible behavioral standards, family vacations that became endurance tests of compliance, and the constant underlying message that we were fundamentally flawed children who needed constant correction to become acceptable human beings. Emma listened without interrupting her teacher instincts, recognizing the signs of someone processing deep trauma. When I finished, she reached across the table and covered my hands with hers. "That's not normal parenting, Rodney. That's emotional abuse. Systematic, calculated emotional abuse designed to break down your sense of self and make you completely dependent on their approval." Hearing those words from someone I trusted, someone with professional experience recognizing harmful patterns, felt like being handed a translation key to my entire childhood. Emma didn't know my parents personally, hadn't been charmed by their public personas or convinced by their carefully crafted family narrative. She could see clearly what I'd been trained to rationalize and excuse. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to investigate my parents' social media presence. They'd embraced Facebook and Instagram with typical Mitchell thoroughness, curating their online image as meticulously as they'd once arranged their dinner parties. Their profiles were filled with family photos spanning decades, each one telling the story of their successful parenting journey. What I found buried in their timeline made my blood run cold. There was a video from my 10th birthday party uploaded years after the fact with a caption about precious family memories. I watched my father presenting me with a bicycle I desperately wanted, making a show of how generous and thoughtful my parents were. Then he launched into a detailed explanation of all the conditions attached to this gift. Specific chores I needed to complete, daily academic performance standards I needed to maintain, and behavioral expectations I needed to meet. The bike would be mine only as long as I proved worthy of it. What made the video so disturbing wasn't just the conditional nature of the gift, but the way the adults in the room laughed approvingly as Dad outlined his requirements. My 10-year-old face in the video showed exactly what I remembered, feeling crushing pressure disguised as generosity. Love with strings attached the exhausting burden of constantly earning what other children received unconditionally. But there was more. Hidden among the hundreds of family photos and celebration posts, I found evidence of their systematic image management. Pictures of family vacations where I remembered being miserable showed us smiling broadly, but I could now see the tension in our shoulders, the careful positioning that hid any signs of distress. Holiday photos featured us in expensive matching outfits, but I remembered the hours of preparation and potential punishment that hung over those photo sessions. Most revealing were the comments from family friends and relatives praising my parents for their dedication and admiring how well-behaved and mature their children always appeared. These adults had unwittingly participated in enabling the very behaviors that had damaged us, mistaking our fearful compliance for exceptional character development. The video that broke me completely was from a family barbecue when I was around 12 years old. In it, my father was telling a story about how I'd recently broken a neighbor's window while playing baseball in our backyard. Rather than handling this privately as most parents would, he'd made me go door to door throughout our neighborhood, explaining my mistake to every single resident and asking for their advice on appropriate punishment. "We believe in teaching natural consequences," he explained to the camera while relatives chuckled appreciatively at his creative parenting. Rodney learned that his actions affect the entire community, not just himself. It was a valuable lesson in personal responsibility. What the video didn't show was my humiliation, as neighbors pitied me the way some had clearly been uncomfortable with being involved in my punishment, or how the incident had been weaponized for months afterward as an example of my careless nature. I'd learned to see myself through the lens of that broken window, destructive, thoughtless someone who needed constant supervision to avoid damaging the world around me. After watching that video, I called Sarah back and we spent 2 hours comparing memories and filling in gaps for each other. She remembered incidents I'd forgotten, and I could provide context for experiences that had confused her as a child. Together, we began to see the full scope of what our parents had done to us. "The worst part," Sarah said near the end of our conversation, "is how they convinced us we were lucky. Remember how they'd tell us about children in foster care or kids whose parents didn't love them enough to provide structure? They made us believe that their control was proof of their love." I did remember. Our parents had been masters of comparative suffering, constantly reminding us that other children had far worse situations. Any complaint about their strictness was met with stories about neglectful parents or tales of juvenile delinquents whose problems stemmed from insufficient discipline. They'd convinced us that their psychological manipulation was actually evidence of superior parenting skills. That night, Emma and I talked until dawn about family systems, trauma responses, and the difference between genuine love and conditional approval. She helped me understand that recognizing the truth about my childhood wasn't betraying my parents. It was reclaiming my right to define my own experiences. "The question now," she said as morning light filtered through my apartment windows, "is what you're going to do with this understanding." I looked at the anniversary invitation still sitting on my coffee table like an unexploded bomb. My parents were expecting their 3 successful children to return home for their celebration, ready to play their assigned roles in the final act of the Mitchell family performance. They had no idea that their carefully constructed narrative was about to face its first real challenge. But I wasn't ready yet. Before I could confront my parents, I needed to understand how deep this conspiracy of silence ran. I needed to know if other family members had seen what was happening and chosen to look away, or if my parents' manipulation had been so complete that even potential allies had been neutralized. The anniversary party was still 2 months away, giving me time to prepare. But first, I needed to have some conversations with relatives I'd barely spoken to in years, people who might hold pieces of the puzzle I was trying to assemble. Starting with my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, who had always seemed slightly uncomfortable during family gatherings, watching us children with concerned eyes that never quite translated into action. Convincing Aunt Patricia to meet with me required careful maneuvering. She'd always maintained a polite distance from our immediate family, attending obligatory holiday gatherings while avoiding deeper involvement in our day-to-day lives. When I called her suggesting coffee to catch up before the anniversary celebration, I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "Of course, Rodney, it would be lovely to see you," she said, but something in her tone suggested she suspected this wasn't a casual reunion. We met at a small coffee shop in Germantown, far enough from my parents' neighborhood to avoid accidental encounters. Patricia arrived first, already seated in a corner booth when I walked in. At 62, she bore a strong resemblance to my mother, but carried herself differently with less rigid posture and more genuine warmth in her expressions. "You look good, Rodney," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "Denver clearly agrees with you." We spent the first 20 minutes on safe topics: my job, the weather, her recent retirement from teaching high school English. But eventually I had to venture into dangerous territory. "Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Did you ever notice anything concerning about how my parents treated us kids when we were growing up? See, watch. The change in her demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, and her eyes darted around the nearly empty coffee shop as if checking for surveillance. When she finally set the cup down, her hands were trembling slightly. Why are you asking me this now, Rodney? Because Sarah's been in therapy dealing with anxiety and depression related to our childhood. Because I've been remembering things that don't match the perfect family story everyone believes. Because I need to know if we were crazy, or if other people saw what was happening to us. Patricia sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, clearly wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, she leaned forward and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. I saw things, Rodney, things that worried me deeply, but every time I tried to express concern, your mother had an explanation. Ready. She and Harold were so articulate, so convincing when they described their parenting philosophy. They made me feel like I was the one who didn't understand proper child rearing. Relief and rage flooded through me simultaneously. Relief that I wasn't imagining things, rage that a potential ally had been neutralized by my parents' manipulation. What kind of things did you see? Patricia glanced around again, then pulled her purse closer and spoke even more quietly. The way you children always looked terrified of making mistakes. Normal kids are messy, loud, sometimes misbehaved. You three moved through that house like you were walking through a minefield, and the punishments your mother would describe at family gatherings always presented as creative discipline or natural consequences. They seemed excessive to me. But Harold would back her up with all this psychology terminology, making it sound scientific and progressive. She paused, struggling with what to say next. There was one Christmas when you were maybe 8 years old. You accidentally knocked over Eleanor's nativity scene while reaching for a present under the tree. The way she reacted, you would have thought you'd committed a crime. She made you spend the entire day in your room while the rest of us opened gifts and had dinner. When I suggested that seemed harsh for an accident, she launched into a lecture about teaching children to be mindful of other people's possessions. The memory came flooding back. I'd forgotten about that Christmas, probably because the psychological pain of missing our family celebration had been too intense to process as a child. But Patricia's account was exactly accurate. I'd spent Christmas Day alone in my bedroom listening to laughter and conversation downstairs, convinced that my clumsiness had ruined Christmas for everyone. Did anyone else in the family notice these things? Tomer, Sinsa. Patricia nodded slowly. Your grandmother. My mother. She was very worried about you children. She used to call me after family visits expressing concern about how fearful you all seemed. She tried talking to Eleanor directly several times, but your mother accused her of undermining her authority and trying to turn the children against their parents. What happened to Grandma's concerns? Eleanor cut her off gradually, started declining invitations for Grandma to visit, claimed you children were too busy with activities and schoolwork to spend time with relatives. When Grandma persisted, Eleanor accused her of favoritism and manipulation. Eventually, the rest of the family started seeing Grandma as a troublemaker, rather than someone with legitimate concerns. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother had tried to protect us, and my parents had systematically destroyed her credibility and access to us. I remembered how visits with Grandma had become increasingly rare, how my parents always had explanations for why we couldn't see her as often. Eventually, she died when I was 15, and I'd felt sad but not devastated. Now, I realized I'd been grieving not just her death, but the relationship my parents had stolen from us years earlier. Patricia, do you still have any of Grandma's letters or documents? Anything where she expressed these concerns in writing? Patricia's eyes widened. Actually, yes. After she passed away, I was going through her things and found several letters she'd written but never sent. Letters to your parents, to other family members, even to Child Protective Services, though I don't think she ever mailed that one. I kept them because they showed how much she loved you children, but I never knew what to do with them. Could I see those letters? Rodney, if Eleanor finds out I'm sharing Grandma's private thoughts with you, she'll never forgive me. You know how your mother holds grudges. Please, Patricia. I need to understand what really happened. Sarah and I are trying to figure out why we're both struggling so much as adults, and these letters might help us understand that we weren't imagining things. After another long pause, Patricia pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos. I took pictures of them last year when I was cleaning out storage boxes. I'll send them to you, but promise me you'll be careful about how you use this information. My phone buzzed with a series of images, each one a handwritten page in my grandmother's familiar script. I opened the first one and immediately felt tears burning my eyes. The letter was dated 3 years before her death, addressed to my parents, but never sent. Dear Eleanor and Harold, it began. I am writing to express my growing concern about the emotional well-being of your children. During my recent visit, I observed behaviors that suggest they are living under constant stress and fear of disappointing you. While I understand that discipline is necessary in child rearing, what I witnessed seemed to go far beyond normal correction. The letter went on to describe specific incidents she'd observed my terror when I'd accidentally spilled juice during lunch. Sarah's desperate attempts to avoid making any noise that might disturb our parents. Marcus's obvious anxiety about upcoming report cards despite his excellent grades. Grandma had documented everything with the careful precision of someone who knew her observations might be dismissed as the concerns of an interfering relative. She saw everything, I whispered, scrolling through image after image of detailed, heartbreaking observations. Your grandmother was a retired social worker, Patricia reminded me. She knew what emotional abuse looked like, but she also knew how difficult it was to prove or address when it came from educated, respected parents who could explain away every concern. One letter addressed to Child Protective Services but marked draft in red ink outlined a pattern of psychological manipulation so comprehensive that it read like a textbook case study. Grandma had documented the isolation tactics, the conditional love, the systematic destruction of our self-esteem, and the way our parents had convinced the extended family that any problems were due to our personal failings rather than their parenting methods. Why didn't she ever send these letters? I asked. Because Eleanor was her daughter and she knew that involving outside authorities would mean losing access to you children completely. She hoped she could find a way to help from within the family, but Eleanor was too smart and too careful to give her that opportunity. As I sat there reading my grandmother's words, I realized that Sarah and I hadn't been alone or crazy or ungrateful. Someone had seen, someone had understood, someone had cared enough to document the truth, even when she couldn't act on it. But my parents had successfully neutralized even this potential ally, turning her from a protective force into someone the family viewed as problematic. Patricia, I said carefully, I need to ask you something else. Has my mother been calling family members recently talking about me? Patricia's face went pale. How did you know? What has she been saying? She called last week very concerned about your emotional state. She said you'd been making troubling phone calls to Sarah, encouraging her to blame childhood experiences for her adult problems. She was worried that you might be having some kind of breakdown, possibly influenced by too much stress at work or an unhealthy relationship. She asked me to keep an ear out for concerning behavior and to let her know if you contacted me. The chess pieces clicked into place. My mother hadn't just spent decades manipulating her children. She'd created an entire family intelligence network designed to protect her narrative and eliminate threats. Even now, 32 years old and living 1,200 miles away, I was still seen as a potential problem that needed monitoring and management. Patricia, what would happen if I told the truth about our childhood at the anniversary party? She stared at me with a mixture of admiration and terror. Rodney, they'll destroy you. Eleanor has spent 50 years building relationships and accumulating social capital. She has allies throughout the extended family, the medical community, and their social circle. If you challenge her publicly, she won't just defend herself, she'll systematically dismantle your credibility and convince everyone that you're the problem. But what if I have evidence? What if I'm not the only one willing to speak up? Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Your cousin David? My son. He's asked me questions over the years about things he witnessed during family visits when he was younger. He was too young to fully understand what he was seeing, but he remembers feeling confused and upset by some of your parents' reactions to normal childhood behavior. David was 26 now, working as a paramedic in Philadelphia. We'd had limited contact over the years, but I remembered him as a sensitive kid who'd always seemed uncomfortable during large family gatherings. Would he be willing to talk to me? I think so. But Rodney, you need to understand what you're really considering here. You're not just planning to confront your parents about your childhood. You're preparing to challenge a narrative that dozens of people have invested in for decades. Some of them will thank you for finally speaking the truth, but others will see you as attacking everything they believed about family parenting and respectability. As I left that coffee shop with my grandmother's letters saved on my phone and a phone number for Cousin David in my contacts, I felt simultaneously more prepared and more terrified than I had since this journey began. I now had documentary evidence and potential witnesses, but I also understood the magnitude of what I was contemplating. My parents hadn't just abused their children, they'd created an entire social system designed to protect and perpetuate that abuse. Breaking that system would require more than just courage. It would require a willingness to sacrifice the comfortable lies that had allowed our extended family to function for decades. The anniversary party was now 6 weeks away, and I still hadn't decided whether to attend. But I knew one thing for certain: if I did go, I wouldn't be going alone anymore. And I wouldn't be going as the grateful, successful son who'd learned to stay quiet about uncomfortable truths. Against Emma's advice and my own better judgment, I found myself driving east toward Philadelphia 2 days before my parents' anniversary celebration. Emma had argued passionately that confronting them at their party would be emotionally devastating for everyone involved, including me. She'd suggested family therapy, written letters, or private conversations as healthier alternatives. But something deep inside me knew that my parents would never voluntarily participate in any process that threatened their carefully constructed narrative. I'd spoken with Cousin David the week before, and his memories had provided crucial corroboration for my grandmother's observations. He remembered specific incidents from childhood visits where our parents' reactions to normal kid behavior had seemed bizarre and frightening to him. More importantly, he was willing to support the truth if I chose to reveal it publicly. "I always wondered why you guys were so different from other kids," he'd told me during our phone conversation. "You moved like robots, like you were terrified of making any kind of mistake. I remember asking my mom once why your family was so serious all the time, and she told me that your parents had high standards. But even as a kid, I knew something felt wrong." The drive to Philadelphia gave me 8 hours to wrestle with my decision. Part of me wanted to turn around and preserve the fragile peace I'd built by maintaining distance and silence. But Sarah's voice echoed in my head, describing her nightmares and panic attacks, her inability to form healthy relationships, because she'd learned to expect love to come with impossible conditions. I arrived at my parents' house on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the Saturday celebration. The colonial mansion looked exactly as I remembered: pristine landscaping, perfectly painted shutters, and an imposing front door that had always made me feel like a visitor rather than a resident. My mother answered the door with her characteristic performance of delighted surprise, as if my arrival wasn't precisely planned and expected. "Rodney, you look wonderful, darling. Denver must be treating you well." She embraced me with the calculated warmth I remembered from childhood, the kind of affection that felt more like a photograph being taken than a genuine moment of connection. My father emerged from his study, extending his hand for the firm handshake he preferred over hugs. At 72, Harold Mitchell remained an imposing figure, tall and silver-haired, with the authoritative bearing that had served him well in his medical career. His smile was genuinely pleased, and I found myself momentarily disarmed by what seemed like authentic happiness at seeing me. "Son, it's good to have you home. I hope you're planning to stay through Sunday. Your mother has organized a recovery brunch for the family, and we'd love to spend more time catching up." The house felt like a museum dedicated to the Mitchell family legacy. Every surface displayed carefully curated evidence of their success: medical awards, charity recognition plaques, professional photographs of their 3 accomplished children, and dozens of images from family vacations that had looked perfect from the outside. I was staying in my childhood bedroom, which had been converted into a guest room but retained enough of my original belongings to trigger uncomfortable memories. My old desk still held a few books from high school, and the closet contained clothes I'd outgrown years ago. But what struck me most was how small everything seemed. How the room that had felt like a prison cell during punishments now appeared almost laughably tiny. That evening we had dinner at their mahogany dining table, the same table where I'd sat through countless lectures about responsibility, respect, and the importance of maintaining our family's reputation. The conversation was polite and surface level, covering safe topics like my work, the weather, and preparations for the anniversary party. But I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way my parents' eyes tracked my every movement, cataloging my facial expressions and body language for signs of discomfort or disagreement. The subtle way my mother redirected any conversation that might lead to discussions of childhood memories or family dynamics. The practiced ease with which my father dominated conversations while making it seem like he was genuinely interested in other people's perspectives. After dinner, I excused myself to help with dishes, hoping for a private moment with my mother. As we stood side by side at the kitchen sink, I decided to test the waters. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about our family lately, especially with this big celebration coming up. I've been wondering if you ever have any regrets about choices you made when we were kids." The glass in her hand stopped moving for just a fraction of a second before she resumed washing with careful deliberation. "Regrets. Darling, your father and I dedicated our lives to raising you children properly. We made sacrifices that you probably don't even realize, turning down social opportunities and professional advancement to ensure you received the guidance and structure you needed. If we have any regrets, it's that we may have been too generous with our time and attention." Her response was so perfectly crafted, so completely deflective, that I realized she'd probably prepared for this exact conversation. She continued washing dishes while delivering what sounded like a rehearsed speech about parental dedication and sacrifice. "Of course, every family has its challenges," she continued smoothly. "Sarah's been struggling with some emotional issues lately, but we've encouraged her to take personal responsibility for her happiness, rather than dwelling on the past. Sometimes young people today are too quick to blame their parents for normal growing pains and life difficulties." I felt a chill run down my spine. My mother had just dismissed her daughter's mental health struggles as character weakness, while simultaneously presenting herself as the victim of ungrateful children. It was a masterclass in manipulation, disguised as reasonable concern. That night I lay awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. Around midnight, I heard voices from my parents' bedroom down the hall. The voices were too quiet to make out words, but the tone suggested an intense discussion. After a while, I heard my father's footsteps heading downstairs to his study. Curiosity overcame caution, and I crept down the hallway in my socks, staying close to the walls to avoid creaky floorboards. My father's study door was partially open, and I could hear him speaking on the phone. "Marcus, I know it's late out there, but we need to discuss the Rodney situation." There was a pause while my brother responded. "Patricia called Eleanor today, very concerned about a conversation she had with him last week. Apparently, he's been asking questions about our parenting methods and seems to be encouraging Sarah's therapy-induced delusions." My blood turned to ice. Aunt Patricia had warned my mother about our conversation exactly as my mother had planned when she'd called family members preemptively. No. We're not going to let this spiral out of control," my father continued. "Dr. Richardson owes me several favors from the hospital board days. If Rodney becomes genuinely problematic, we can have him evaluated for a psychiatric emergency. Sometimes adult children experience delayed stress reactions that manifest as false memories or paranoid ideation about their childhood." I pressed myself against the wall, hardly breathing, as I listened to my father casually discuss having me committed to protect their reputation. This wasn't defensive parenting or concern for family harmony. This was calculated destruction of anyone who threatened their narrative. The key is documentation, he continued. Eleanor's been keeping records of concerning phone calls and behavioral reports from family members. If we need to demonstrate that Rodney is having a psychological crisis, we have evidence of erratic behavior and delusional thinking. There was another pause while Marcus spoke. Exactly. We've invested 50 years building our reputation and family legacy. We're not going to let ungrateful children destroy that because they've decided to rewrite history with help from some incompetent therapist. Sarah's always been weak and suggestible. Now she's apparently convinced Rodney to join her victim narrative. I carefully backed away from the study and returned to my room, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would wake the entire house. My parents weren't just defensive about their parenting. They were actively conspiring to neutralize any threat to their public image. They'd already enlisted Marcus as an ally and were prepared to use medical professionals to have me declared mentally unstable if necessary. The next morning, Sarah arrived unexpectedly, having decided at the last minute to attend the anniversary after all. She looked tired and anxious, but there was something different in her posture, a kind of determined strength I hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me quietly as we sat on the back patio, safely away from our parents' ears. "About how staying silent protects them, but destroys us. My therapist says that healing requires bringing secrets into the light even when it's frightening." I told her about the phone conversation I'd overheard, watching her face grow pale as I described our father's plans. But instead of retreating into fear, Sarah's jaw set with resolve. "They think they can silence us by threatening our credibility. They think we'll back down rather than risk looking unstable." She shook her head firmly. "Rodney, I brought something with me. Letters from my therapist documenting our treatment history, research articles about family trauma patterns, and written statements from 3 other clients she's worked with who experienced similar childhood environments. If they want to claim we're delusional, let them explain why multiple mental health professionals recognize the same abuse patterns." "Sarah, if we do this, if we speak publicly at their party, there's no going back. They'll try to destroy us socially, professionally, maybe even legally. Are you prepared for that kind of warfare?" She looked at me with eyes that had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. "Rodney, they've already been destroying us just quietly and slowly. The difference is that now we have a chance to fight back. I'd rather be honest and hated than silent and dying inside." That afternoon, as our parents bustled around preparing for their celebration, Sarah and I sat in my childhood bedroom making our own preparations. We reviewed timeline details, coordinated our accounts, and prepared for the emotional battlefield that tomorrow would bring. We also called Cousin David, who confirmed he would attend the party and was prepared to support our account if necessary. "Remember," Sarah said as we finalized our plan, "we're not doing this to hurt them. We're doing this to free ourselves and possibly protect other people from similar manipulation. The truth doesn't become less true just because it's inconvenient." As evening fell on the night before the anniversary party, I felt simultaneously more terrified and more determined than I'd ever been in my life. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed Mitchell family narrative would face its first real challenge in 50 years. My parents had no idea that their celebration was about to become the setting for the truth they'd spent decades hiding. The golden anniversary invitations had promised an evening of joy, remembrance, and family love. They were about to deliver something entirely different. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and golden anniversary decorations as Philadelphia's elite gathered to celebrate Harold and Eleanor Mitchell's 50 years of marriage. Women in designer gowns and men in expensive suits filled the elegant space, their conversations creating a sophisticated murmur that mixed with the gentle music from a string quartet positioned near the dance floor. I stood near the bar in my best navy suit, watching my parents work the room with practiced grace. They moved like seasoned politicians, stopping at each cluster of guests to deliver personalized greetings and carefully crafted anecdotes about their long journey together. My mother wore an elegant champagne-colored gown that caught the light beautifully, while my father looked distinguished in his classic black tuxedo with a white pocket square. More than 100 people had come to honor the couple that everyone considered relationship goals. Hospital colleagues praised my father's medical achievements and mentorship of young doctors. Charity board members celebrated my mother's dedication to community service and fundraising success. Longtime friends shared warm stories about double dates and family vacations spanning decades. Sarah stood across the room in a midnight blue dress, looking nervous but resolute. We'd barely spoken since arriving, both of us understanding that our parents would be monitoring our interactions for signs of coordinated behavior. Marcus had flown in from Los Angeles that morning and immediately positioned himself as the family spokesman, regaling guests with stories about our parents' exceptional dedication and wisdom. But I noticed undercurrents that most guests probably missed. Family members kept approaching me throughout the evening with subtle questions designed to assess my emotional state. Cousin Amanda asked how I was handling stress at work. Uncle Robert wondered if I'd been getting enough sleep lately. My mother's sister Janet made casual comments about young people today who blamed their parents for normal life challenges. The coordination was too perfect to be coincidental. My parents had clearly briefed their allies on my potentially unstable condition, preparing them to document any concerning behavior that might support future intervention efforts. Around 8 o'clock, Marcus took the microphone for the formal toasts. He delivered a glowing 10-minute speech about our parents' unconditional love and perfect example of parenting, describing how their wise guidance and unwavering standards had shaped him into a successful adult. The guests applauded enthusiastically as he painted a picture of childhood filled with adventure learning and infinite parental support. I watched Sarah's face grow increasingly pale as our brother systematically rewrote our family history. When Marcus described our parents' discipline as firm but fair guidance that taught us respect and responsibility, Sarah's hands began trembling. When he claimed that we'd always felt completely secure in our parents' love and approval, she abruptly left the ballroom. I found her in the women's lounge sitting on an elegant velvet chair and hyperventilating. Her carefully applied makeup was smeared with tears, and she was struggling to catch her breath. "I can't listen to this anymore. Rodney," she gasped between shallow breaths. Hearing him describe our childhood like it was some perfect fairy tale, while everyone nods and smiles like they believe it. It's making me feel crazy again, like maybe I really did imagine everything. I knelt beside her chair, speaking in the calm voice I'd learned to use during her panic attacks. "Sarah, breathe with me. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. You didn't imagine anything. Marcus is either lying deliberately or he's convinced himself that the abuse was normal parenting. But we know what really happened." But what if people don't believe us? What if they think we're just bitter, ungrateful kids who want to blame our problems on our parents? Before I could answer, the lounge door opened and my mother appeared, her face showing carefully controlled concern. "Sarah, darling, several people noticed you seemed upset. Are you feeling all right? Perhaps the excitement of the evening is overwhelming for you." The maternal tone was perfect, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was gathering information about Sarah's emotional state while positioning herself as the caring mother dealing with a difficult daughter. "I'm fine, Mom." Sarah managed her voice steadier than I'd expected. Just needed a moment to catch my breath. "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need." Though I should mention Marcus was hoping to include his siblings in his closing remarks. The guests would love to hear from all 3 of my successful children. The expectation was clear. We were supposed to return to the ballroom and participate in the final act of their celebration, adding our voices to the chorus of praise and gratitude. "We'll be right there," I said, helping Sarah to her feet. My mother smiled and glided back toward the ballroom, confident that her children would fulfill their assigned roles in her perfect evening. But as Sarah and I stood in that elegant lounge looking at ourselves in the gilt-framed mirrors, something shifted between us. We looked like successful adults in expensive clothes attending a beautiful celebration of family love and commitment. But we both knew that underneath those surface appearances, we were still the frightened children who'd never felt safe enough to speak the truth. "Rodney," Sarah said quietly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. "I think this is our moment. If we don't speak now, we never will. They'll continue this performance forever, and we'll spend our lives wondering what would have happened if we'd been brave enough to tell the truth." When we returned to the ballroom, Marcus was concluding his speech and preparing to invite us to join him at the podium. The guests were glowing with wine and warm feelings, ready to celebrate the next generation of this extraordinary family. But instead of walking toward the stage, I changed direction and approached the string quartet. The musicians looked surprised when I asked to borrow their microphone, but they handed it over with professional courtesy. The ballroom gradually quieted as guests noticed that someone had taken control of the sound system without authorization. My parents looked confused and slightly annoyed from their seats at the head table, clearly expecting me to make brief, appreciative remarks before returning the microphone to Marcus. I looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom had known me since childhood. These people had attended birthday parties and graduation ceremonies, had watched me grow up believing I was living in an ideal family environment. They trusted my parents completely and were prepared to hear another grateful testimonial from a successful son. Instead, I began to speak about the systematic psychological abuse that had defined my childhood. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Many of you have known our family for decades, and you've seen the public face of Harold and Eleanor Mitchell's parenting approach. Tonight I want to share some experiences you haven't seen, experiences that shaped my sister and me in ways that took us years to understand." The energy in the room changed immediately. Conversations stopped completely. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips, and every face turned toward me, with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. My mother's face had gone white, and my father was half rising from his chair, clearly planning to interrupt what he recognized as a potential disaster. But I kept talking, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "When I was 8 years old, I accidentally broke a glass while setting the dinner table. My punishment wasn't a brief scolding or having to clean up the mess. I was locked in a closet for 4 hours while my parents entertained dinner guests, listening to laughter and conversation from my dark, cramped prison. This wasn't unusual parenting in our house. It was Tuesday." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Several guests looked toward my parents for clarification or denial, but Harold and Eleanor sat frozen, clearly calculating their response to this unprecedented public challenge. When my sister Sarah was 6, she wet the bed during a family vacation. Rather than handling this normal childhood occurrence with understanding, our parents made her carry her stained sheets to the hotel laundry room and explain to strangers what had happened. They called this natural consequences, but what it really taught her was that normal human needs and accidents were sources of shame that deserved public humiliation. Sarah had moved closer to the stage, her face pale but determined. When our eyes met, she nodded almost imperceptibly, giving me permission to continue. For years, we told ourselves that we'd misremembered these experiences, that surely our loving, successful parents couldn't have been systematically destroying our sense of self-worth. We convinced ourselves that we were being dramatic, oversensitive, unable to appreciate the structure and guidance our parents provided. The ballroom was utterly silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place as they witnessed a family narrative crumbling in real time. But recently my sister began therapy for severe anxiety and depression. Her therapist helped her recognize that what we'd experienced wasn't strict parenting or character building. It was emotional abuse designed to make us completely dependent on our parents' approval while destroying our ability to trust our own perceptions. I could see my father whispering urgently to people at his table, probably activating whatever damage control plan they'd prepared for this contingency. But I was beyond their reach, now protected by distance and determination. I want to be clear about something. My parents provided for us, materially ensured we received excellent educations, and maintained a household that looked perfect from the outside. But behind closed doors, they systematically undermined our emotional development through manipulation, isolation, and psychological control, that left lasting damage we're still working to heal. The microphone felt steady in my hands as I delivered the words I'd been afraid to speak for 24 years. So tonight, as you celebrate their 50 years of marriage, I ask you to consider what that celebration cost the 3 children who lived under their roof. And I hope that any parents in this room will remember that love without conditions, guidance without fear, and structure without cruelty are not just possible, but necessary for raising healthy human beings. I set the microphone down on a nearby table and walked toward the exit, feeling simultaneously lighter and more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. Behind me, the elegant ballroom erupted into chaos as guests tried to process what they'd just heard, and my parents scrambled to regain control of their shattered narrative. Sarah caught up with me in the hotel corridor, tears streaming down her face, but her posture straighter than I'd seen it in years. "We did it," she whispered, grabbing my hand. "We finally told the truth." The consequences would be severe and immediate. But for the first time in our lives, Sarah and I had chosen honesty over harmony, truth over performance, and our own healing over our parents' reputation. The perfect Mitchell family anniversary celebration was officially over. The hotel corridor outside the ballroom felt like the eye of a hurricane, as Sarah and I stood together holding hands and listening to the chaos we'd unleashed inside. Through the heavy doors, we could hear raised voices, the scraping of chairs being pushed back, and what sounded like several urgent conversations happening simultaneously. Within minutes, the first wave of family members burst through the doors. My cousin Amanda led the charge, her face flushed with rage and champagne. "How dare you?" she hissed, advancing on us with her finger pointed accusingly. "How dare you humiliate Harold and Eleanor like that? They've done nothing but love and support this family for 50 years, and you repay them by spreading vicious lies at their anniversary celebration." Behind her came Uncle Robert, my father's brother, and my Aunt Janet, my mother's sister. Their expressions ranged from shocked confusion to obvious anger, and I realized that my parents' damage control efforts were already in motion. "Rodney, what's gotten into you?" Uncle Robert demanded. "I've known you since you were born, and this behavior is completely out of character. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Are you on medication that might be affecting your judgment?" The questions came exactly as I'd expected. Rather than addressing the content of my revelations, they were attacking my mental state and credibility. This was the playbook my parents had prepared, and their allies were executing it perfectly. But before I could respond, Cousin David appeared behind the group, his face pale but resolute. "Actually, Uncle Robert, I think Rodney's behavior makes perfect sense. I've been wondering for years when someone was finally going to acknowledge what we all witnessed during family gatherings." The hostile group turned toward David with surprise. He wasn't supposed to be an ally in this situation. "David, what are you talking about?" Aunt Janet snapped. "I'm talking about the way Rodney, Sarah, and Marcus always looked terrified during family visits. I'm talking about punishments that seemed way out of proportion to normal kid behavior. I'm talking about the way Harold and Eleanor controlled every aspect of their children's lives while making it look like superior parenting." David stepped closer to Sarah and me, physically positioning himself as support rather than opposition. "I was too young to understand it then, but I remember thinking your family was different from other families. Kids in our house could make mistakes without facing hours of consequences. Kids in our house could laugh loudly without worrying about disturbing the adults. Kids in our house were allowed to have opinions without being lectured about respect and gratitude." Amanda's face grew even redder. "So, now you're all conspiring together, creating some fantasy narrative about childhood trauma because you can't take responsibility for your own adult problems?" The ballroom doors opened again, and more family members emerged, including several people I didn't immediately recognize. But among them, walking slowly but purposefully, was someone who made my heart leap with relief. Dr. Robert Chen, the elderly family friend who'd helped fund my father's medical practice, approached our growing group with the measured pace of someone who'd made a difficult decision. "I owe everyone an apology," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of age and professional experience. "Particularly Harold and Eleanor's children. The hostile family members fell silent, clearly not expecting intervention from someone of Dr. Chen's standing in their community. I've suspected for many years that something was wrong in the Mitchell household. As a psychiatrist, I recognized signs of emotional manipulation and control that went far beyond normal parenting boundaries. But Harold was my colleague and friend, and Eleanor was active in many of the same charitable organizations as my wife. I convinced myself that their children seemed successful and well-adjusted. So perhaps I was misreading the situation. Dr. Chen looked directly at me and Sarah, his eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine regret. But success and adjustment can coexist with significant emotional damage, especially when children learn early that survival depends on perfect performance and absolute compliance. What Rodney described tonight matches patterns I've observed in many families where parents use sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as superior child-rearing. The group around us had grown as more people emerged from the ballroom, drawn by the commotion in the corridor. Some faces showed confusion and concern. Others displayed obvious loyalty to my parents, but a few showed something else: recognition. An older woman I didn't immediately recognize stepped forward hesitantly. "I'm Margaret Walsh. I worked with Eleanor on the hospital auxiliary for 15 years. I hate to say this at such a difficult moment, but I always felt uncomfortable with how she described her children. She would share stories about their punishments and discipline that seemed quite severe, but she presented them as examples of effective parenting that other mothers should emulate." Another voice spoke up from the back of the group. "I'm Tom Bradley. I live next door to the Mitchells. I used to hear things through our shared wall sometimes, children crying for extended periods, adults speaking in very stern tones. I always assumed it was normal family discipline, but it did seem more intense than what happened in other houses on our street." The momentum was shifting. People who'd been prepared to defend my parents were now hearing corroboration from multiple sources, including respected community members who had no apparent reason to fabricate or exaggerate. But the most powerful moment came when the ballroom doors opened one more time and my parents emerged, flanked by Marcus and several of their closest allies. My mother's face was a mask of controlled fury, while my father looked like a general whose battle plan had been completely disrupted. "Rodney, Sarah," my mother said in her most authoritative tone, "I think you've both suffered enough embarrassment for one evening. Dr. Richardson is here tonight, and he's agreed to provide immediate evaluation and support for what appears to be a shared psychological crisis." Dr. Richardson stepped forward, a thin man in his 60s whom I recognized as one of my father's longtime colleagues. He was carrying what appeared to be a medical bag and wore the expression of someone prepared to handle a psychiatric emergency. What my father added, "We're going to get you the help you need. This kind of delusional thinking and public breakdown requires immediate professional intervention." It was exactly what I'd overheard them planning the night before. They were attempting to have me declared mentally unstable in front of witnesses, using their medical connections to override any protest I might make. But before Dr. Richardson could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "I don't think that will be necessary." Dr. Patricia Hammond, Sarah's therapist, stepped out of the crowd. I hadn't seen her arrive, but apparently Sarah had contacted her when the situation began escalating. "Dr. Richardson, I'm Patricia Hammond. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist who's been working with Sarah Mitchell for several months. I can assure you that neither Rodney nor Sarah is experiencing a psychological crisis. They're exhibiting entirely normal responses to confronting family trauma, and their accounts are consistent with documented patterns of emotional abuse I've observed in my practice." Dr. Richardson looked between Dr. Hammond and my father, clearly uncomfortable with the professional contradiction he was facing. "Furthermore," Dr. Hammond continued, "I have written documentation of Sarah's treatment history, including detailed notes about family dynamics and trauma patterns. If anyone is interested in evidence-based assessment rather than damage control, I'm prepared to provide professional consultation." The circle of onlookers had grown to include nearly half the anniversary guests, and the conversation had evolved into something resembling a public trial. But instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, I felt stronger with each person who stepped forward to support the truth. Emma appeared at my side, having arrived just as Dr. Hammond had. She'd driven from Denver when I'd texted her about the confrontation, understanding that I would need support during the aftermath. "I've brought something else," she announced, pulling out her phone. Audio recordings of conversations between Rodney and his sister, where they discuss specific incidents from their childhood, including dates, locations, and witnesses. These recordings were made weeks ago, long before tonight's events, which demonstrates that their accounts are consistent and premeditated rather than impulsive fabrications. My mother's composure finally cracked. "This is a conspiracy," she declared, her voice rising to a pitch that carried clearly through the hotel corridor. "A coordinated attack on our family, orchestrated by unstable children and enabled by incompetent professionals who profit from encouraging victim mentalities." But as she spoke, I noticed several more people stepping away from her side of the group and moving toward ours. The evidence was mounting, the witnesses were multiplying, and the narrative my parents had protected for 50 years was crumbling under the weight of truth. Marcus remained loyal to our parents, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. But his isolation was becoming obvious as former allies reconsidered their positions based on the accumulating testimony. The most dramatic moment came when my Aunt Patricia, who had initially tried to remain neutral, pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the photographs of our grandmother's letters. "I think it's time everyone knew what my mother tried to tell this family before she died," she announced, her voice shaking but determined. She documented years of concerning behavior and tried repeatedly to address her fears about Eleanor and Harold's parenting methods. As Patricia began reading excerpts from our grandmother's letters aloud, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the sensation of truth finally being stronger than the forces that had suppressed it. The perfect Mitchell family anniversary celebration had become the setting for the most honest conversation our family had ever experienced. And despite the chaos, the anger, and the broken relationships that would inevitably follow, I felt more hopeful than I had in years. The truth was finally free, and we were no longer alone with it. The weeks following that explosive anniversary celebration became a period of unprecedented honesty and reckoning within our extended family. The immediate aftermath was brutal, but necessary, like surgery that causes pain while removing something toxic that had been poisoning the entire system. My parents' reputation in Philadelphia society suffered immediate and lasting damage. Within days of the party, 3 board positions were quietly withdrawn. 2 charity events were rescheduled without Eleanor's involvement, and several prominent families began declining social invitations from the Mitchells. The medical community's response was more measured but equally significant as colleagues began questioning Harold's judgment and professional ethics in ways that affected his remaining consulting work. Dr. Richardson's attempt to have me declared mentally unstable backfired spectacularly when Dr. Hammond filed formal complaints about his unprofessional conduct. The Pennsylvania State Board of Medicine launched an inquiry into his willingness to diagnose patients he'd never formally evaluated, based solely on requests from personal friends. His medical license wasn't revoked, but the investigation created a permanent mark on his professional record that effectively ended his career in psychiatric evaluation. The most gratifying development came when several other family members finally felt safe enough to share their own experiences with Harold and Eleanor's manipulative behavior. Cousin David's older sister revealed that she'd been subjected to emotional abuse during extended stays at our house as a child. 2 of my father's nephews admitted they'd witnessed concerning incidents during family gatherings, but had been too intimidated to speak up at the time. Marcus remained stubbornly loyal to our parents for nearly 3 months, continuing to describe the anniversary confrontation as a coordinated attack by unstable siblings seeking attention. But his position became increasingly untenable as more evidence emerged and more family members confirmed our accounts. The breaking point for Marcus came when Aunt Patricia shared our grandmother's letters with him directly. Seeing his beloved grandmother's detailed documentation of abuse patterns written years before any of us had begun questioning our childhood experiences finally cracked his defensive wall. He called me on a Tuesday evening in March, 6 months after the anniversary disaster. "Rodney," his voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying. "I read Grandma's letters. All of them. Every single observation she made about our family, every concern she expressed about how we were being treated. I waited, understanding that this was Marcus's moment to process 24 years of suppressed memories and denied reality. I convinced myself that what happened to us was normal, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. If our parents were abusive, that meant my entire identity as a successful person from a loving family was built on a lie. It meant that everything I'd achieved was somehow tainted by the damage they'd done to us. Marcus, your achievements aren't tainted. You survived and succeeded despite what they did to us, not because of it. He was quiet for a long moment. I need to apologize to you and Sarah. I need to start my own therapy, and I need to figure out how to have a relationship with our parents that doesn't require me to deny reality or betray my siblings. That conversation marked the beginning of Marcus's own healing journey and our family's slow reconstruction around honesty rather than mythology. Sarah flourished in ways that amazed everyone who knew her. With the family conspiracy of silence finally broken, she threw herself into therapy with renewed energy and purpose. Dr. Hammond helped her understand that speaking truth at the anniversary party hadn't been a breakdown, but a breakthrough, the moment when she finally chose her own well-being over her parents' reputation. She started a blog about surviving emotional abuse in high-achieving families, which quickly gained a following among readers who recognized similar patterns in their own experiences. Her writing was raw, honest, and healing not just for her, but for hundreds of people who'd felt isolated and crazy for questioning perfect-looking family environments. Within a year, Sarah had left her unfulfilling marketing job and enrolled in a graduate program in social work planning to specialize in family trauma and childhood emotional abuse. She'd found her calling in helping other people navigate the complex journey from denial to healing. My relationship with Emma deepened as she witnessed my transformation from someone carrying invisible wounds to someone actively engaged in healing them. She'd supported me through the most difficult period of my life without trying to fix me or minimize the significance of what I'd experienced. Her steady presence taught me what unconditional love actually looked like, in contrast to the conditional approval I'd grown up believing was affection. We moved in together that spring, creating a home environment based on mutual respect, honest communication, and the radical concept that people could make mistakes without facing consequences designed to destroy their self-worth. Simple things like burning dinner or forgetting to take out trash became opportunities for gentle problem-solving rather than character assassination. The legal ramifications for my parents were minimal but symbolically important. Harold's medical license remained active, but he was quietly excluded from several professional organizations after colleagues learned about his personal conduct. Eleanor faced no formal consequences for her emotional abuse, since such behavior rarely meets legal definitions of actionable harm. But her social influence evaporated as former friends and allies distanced themselves from the family scandal. More significantly, both of my parents were forced to confront their behavior in ways they'd never anticipated. The family conspiracy that had protected and enabled their manipulation for decades had dissolved, leaving them isolated with the truth they'd spent 50 years denying. My mother made several attempts to rebuild relationships with her children, but these efforts were hampered by her inability to acknowledge wrongdoing without immediately justifying or minimizing it. She would call to apologize for being too strict, while maintaining that her intentions were loving and her methods were necessary. These partial apologies felt like further manipulation rather than genuine accountability. My father's response was characteristically more calculated. He researched family therapy approaches and offered to participate in professional mediation, but only if we agreed to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past misunderstandings. His willingness to engage professionally was encouraging, but his continued framing of abuse as misunderstanding suggested that true change would be difficult. After extensive discussion with our therapists and each other, Sarah, Marcus, and I established clear boundaries for any future relationship with our parents. We required genuine acknowledgement of specific harmful behaviors, commitment to ongoing therapy for them individually and together, and acceptance that rebuilding trust would be a long-term process with no guaranteed outcome. Our parents initially rejected these conditions as punitive and unfair, but eventually agreed to begin individual therapy when they realized that complete estrangement was the alternative. The process has been slow and often frustrating, but there have been moments of genuine progress that give me hope for eventual healing. The broader impact of our family's public reckoning extended far beyond our immediate circle. Several friends and colleagues reached out to share their own experiences with emotionally abusive family systems, creating opportunities for connection and mutual support that I'd never anticipated. My story seemed to give other people permission to question family narratives they'd accepted without examination. Dr. Patricia Hammond asked if she could use our family's experience as a case study in her research on high-functioning abusive families, particularly those that maintain positive public images while causing significant private harm. With our permission, she published an academic paper that helped other mental health professionals recognize and address similar patterns in their own practices. A year after the anniversary confrontation, Sarah and I received an unexpected letter from a woman named Jennifer, whose parents had been guests at the party. She wrote that witnessing our public testimony had inspired her to finally address emotional abuse in her own family, leading to therapeutic breakthroughs that had improved her mental health dramatically. "Your courage to speak truth in that ballroom gave me permission to speak truth in my therapist's office," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that family loyalty doesn't require accepting harmful treatment, and that healing is possible even when it disrupts comfortable lies." Reading Jennifer's letter reminded me that our decision to confront our parents publicly hadn't just been about our own healing. It had created ripple effects of honesty and courage that extended far beyond our immediate situation. 2 years later, Sarah and I hosted our own celebration, a small gathering of chosen family members who loved us unconditionally rather than conditionally. Emma, Dr. Hammond, cousin David, and Patricia Marcus and his partner, and several close friends joined us for an evening that celebrated authenticity over performance healing, over harm, and truth over mythology. As I looked around that table at people who'd supported our journey from denial to healing, I realized that we'd accomplished something I'd never thought possible. We'd created a family environment based on genuine love rather than manipulative control, mutual respect, rather than demanded obedience and honest communication, rather than calculated image management. The process had cost us relationships with extended family members who couldn't accept our truth social connections that depended on maintaining the Mitchell family mythology and the comfortable illusion that our childhood trauma could remain buried forever. But what we'd gained was immeasurably more valuable: the freedom to be ourselves, without fear, the ability to form healthy relationships based on reality rather than performance, and the knowledge that we'd broken a cycle of emotional abuse that might have continued for generations. My parents now live quieter lives, their social circle diminished, but their public humiliation eventually superseded by newer scandals and fresher gossip. They continue individual therapy and have made genuine progress in acknowledging specific harmful behaviors, though rebuilding trust remains a work in progress that may take years or may never fully succeed. But their journey toward accountability is no longer my primary concern. My focus now is on the life Sarah and I have built from the ashes of our family's mythology, grounded in truth, sustained by love, and dedicated to ensuring that the cycle of emotional manipulation ends with our generation. The most profound lesson I learned through this experience is that speaking truth, even when it destroys comfortable lies, is the only path to genuine healing and authentic relationships. Families built on denial and manipulation may look perfect from the outside, but they create invisible prisons for everyone trapped within them. Breaking those prisons requires courage, support, and a willingness to accept that some people will choose protecting their comfortable narratives over embracing difficult truths. But for those brave enough to choose honesty over harmony, the rewards include freedom, authentic love, and the possibility of building healthier families for future generations. The anniversary party that was supposed to celebrate my parents' perfect marriage became instead the beginning of our family's first honest conversation in 50 years. And while the process was painful, chaotic, and destructive to relationships built on lies, it was also healing, liberating, and ultimately transformative for everyone willing to embrace the truth. As I write this story sitting in the home Emma and I now share, I'm surrounded by evidence of what healthy family life can look like. No one walks on eggshells here. Mistakes are learning opportunities rather than character failures. Love is offered freely rather than earned through perfect behavior. And truth is valued more than reputation, healing more than harmony, and authenticity more than applause. If you're reading this and recognizing patterns from your own family experience, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not ungrateful, and you're not alone. Speaking truth about family dysfunction is one of the most difficult things you can do, but it's also one of the most necessary. Your healing matters more than other people's comfort with familiar lies. The journey from denial to truth is never easy, but it's always worth it. And you deserve to live in the light of honesty rather than the shadows of family mythology. Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and protecting your own mental health? How did you find the courage to speak your truth when others wanted you to stay silent? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below because sharing our experiences helps all of us feel less alone in these difficult journeys. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find it who might need to hear this message. Subscribe to my channel for more stories about healing courage and the power of truth. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from knowing that family loyalty doesn't require accepting harmful treatment. Thank you for listening to this story and for being part of a community that values honesty over pretense and healing over harm. Remember that your truth matters, your healing is important, and you deserve relationships built on genuine love rather than conditional approval. Take care of yourselves and remember that speaking truth is always an act of courage worth celebrating.